You're listening to Dropping Pins, a story-based learning series from the Okayest Hunter podcast, hosted by Derek Melkor, and aimed at helping you hone your whitetail hunting skills. You'll hear the aha moments when known and unknown proven whitetail killers started consistently putting mature bucks on the ground.
Well, good evening. Welcome to Dropping Pins podcast, part of the Okayest Hunter podcast network. Oh, it's been a day, man. It has been a day. That beer's tasting awfully good. I've just had nothing but issues with this stupid podcast stuff. I'm starting to realize why more people don't attempt this, even though there's a handful of people, and by handful, I mean a handful of millions of people who got their podcast going. This stuff's been a nightmare for me. I'm not good with tech stuff, so we'll skip over that. I think this is working, so if you're seeing it, yay, it worked. But I've got a really good guest on for this podcast right here. This is a good friend of mine. We met in college over deer hunting, of course. I don't know if we'll tell that story of how we met, but it's a pretty good one. But this fella is an absolute killer. If there was a group of 10 guys going hunting anywhere in the country, I'd put $50 that this gentleman kills a deer no matter what, above anybody else. We grew up hunting lots of different spots together, some public, some private. He's killed tons of good ones in Wisconsin. He's killed huge ones in Missouri. He's killed buck in Illinois. Guy's an all-around killer and has hunted a lot of different terrain. And we're just good buddies, talk hunting all the time. So I'm excited to get him on here. He is a real crucial member to Chase Nation. They produce a bunch of really high quality hunting videos. Dave not only is in the hunting feature of that, but is amazing behind the lens on what he does with videography and photography. Also has a son and a daughter, much like myself. So family man, great behind the camera, filming and doing all the stuff for Chase Nation. If you've not seen any of their videos before, they are beautifully done, really high quality. Go check those out. But yeah, let's bring him on. This is my good buddy, Dave Bechtel. Dave, how you doing, my guy?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Oh, man, as we just talked, not living the dream, but it's getting better because I got a cold beer. I'm talking to you about deer. So,
Well, that's always good. Reliving old days, right?
oh, you know it. I see you're looking like you're down in the basement, hanging out in the man cave tonight.
Yeah, I'm hiding out. Kyla's upstairs watching $1 Million Listing, and kids are sleeping, and I'm hiding down here. So we're good.
Yeah, I just ran up to grab a beer when I thought I had it all set up. It was time to celebrate. So I ran upstairs to grab a beer quick. And I see Gus, my son, sitting at the kitchen counter next to mom after he was put to bed. And he's got a big shit eating grin on his face. And he goes, "Hi, Dad. High five." And I was like, "Get back to your bed, little man."
That's awesome.
Yeah. So, no, I'm really, really glad to have you on and get to hear a little bit from you. Um, the first question I got for you, for our listeners, basically, but as we get into stories tonight, if you just want to maybe extrapolate a little bit on, where you grew up hunting, what kind of terrain, what kind of stuff that you kind of cut your teeth in, and then maybe a little bit about what you've been doing more recently, what kind of terrain you've been on, so people have some context with the stories that you're telling tonight.
Yeah, my story is a little, I would almost bet, way different than most others. Got into hunting, gun hunting with my father out in western Wisconsin, Crawford County, but the main chunk of my hunting came from my aunt. She's a union iron worker. She's retired. But we hunted the Tressa Marsh public land, and every weekend I would go to her house and we would go hunt public land. And she's a badass.
That's
And
so cool.
that's kind of like how I got into it. Bow hunting was with my Aunt Karen, and we would go every weekend. And the story I'm going to tell about when it kind of clicked was actually with her, ironically.
Excellent.
But, she was kind of the one that ingrained that in me. And every weekend we'd go out, but more or less now. Do hunt some public land. Got some permission pieces locally around me that I hunt on. All farm country, but within that farm country, there's a lot of swamp and marshy stuff in that. So kind of bounce back and forth, but I'm not sold to one. I try to stay as mobile as possible, but um, yeah, I grew up cutting my teeth on public land before public land was cool. So um,
Back when the people you were rubbing shoulders with were not trying to prove something, they literally just had to go there because it was the only option.
yeah, and honestly, like, it wasn't, you know, going there because it was cool. It was just like, oh, the Tressa Marsh is massive. And really, there wasn't that much hunting pressure. And even you go there now, depending on the time of the year, the pressure is not bad. It's just being able to escape. And I remember uh, this is when you could walk the railroad tracks. We would always walk. There was a certain mile marker on the railroad tracks that we would walk. And when you had your headlamp, and if you went in alone, you knew when you hit this mile marker, and it was multiple miles, you cut in. So, I mean, that was kind of fun. But that's and Karen's the real reason that bow hunting really kind of resonated with me.
And just to give a little bit more, I guess, background as to how Dave's mentality kind of works, you are a die-hard bow hunter. I mean, there's a lot of guys in different states, and like especially here in Wisconsin, who are deer hunters. And you pick up the bow when it's bow season, you pick up the gun when it's gun season. And I'm not saying you won't pick up a gun, but I know you're a guy who just you feel way more confident with your bow. You are a true bow hunter of all the guys I know. You'd rather have a bow in your hand than any other weapon, I feel like.
Yeah, 100%. Like, I don't know. I still feel like I flinch whenever the gun goes off. And I'm almost 40 years old and I still flinch, but like that's why like I always joke with people like at 50 yards, you give me a gun with a scope, I'm more confident with my bow. Or
Well, you're a
even
damn good shot too.
you go to like even 75 yards, it's like if I had my shotgun, it's like, well, I don't know if I could hit that. And it's like, well, if I had my bow, I know I could. And I think that's practice, um growing up, you know, arrows you can reuse. Bullets were always expensive and, having to shoot, and I couldn't shoot a gun at my house growing up, but I could shoot a bow endlessly. So I was always gravitated. I worked in multiple archery shops growing up, so that was just kind of always my thing. Like I love archery, and there's a challenge to it that it really brings you centered.
Hell yeah, man. And just having, you know, grown up most of my adult life hunting with you a lot and shooting with you, man, it you're just a testament to the practice you put in is what you get out of it. Because Dave's got a pretty sweet setup now at his house with a nice range that goes out. But man, you're a guy that consistently puts in time shooting your bow, and it pays off because if a deer is within 50 yards of you, you always seem to find a way to get that deer on the ground. And I've always been just so impressed by that because I've not had the same. I'm not going to call it luck. I don't have that same skill.
I'd
I
rather be.
usually find a way to mess it up.
No, you spend a lot of your time, especially nowadays with social media, like there's a lot of fidgeting, I would call it, and guys gear out and they tweak their setups. But truthfully, at the end of the day, in my opinion, if you took that time and you actually shot your bow, you might be a little better off. Um, you know, I think there's less focus on shooting and the execution of the shot, and there's more focus on the gadgets you have in the tree with you, which those gadgets do help. But I would say being efficient at shooting your bow is much more productive, and
There's
will
no doubt.
will give you much more or much better results, in my opinion. So
No
the
doubt.
2 hours at night you tweak your stand to get a half a pound lighter. You could have took that time and just even blank bale shot in your basement at 3 yards, or um, shot out to 40 behind your garage. And come October, that probably would have paid more dividends than the half a pound you saved.
100%. And I guess the aim of this little segment of the podcast and what we're doing here is based in education. Dave is a teacher also, which I think is important to point out. We're both educators, and if anybody takes anything away, we haven't even mentioned hunting yet, but if you take anything away from anything Dave's going to say, there's going to be some good stuff. But take that away. If you're a beginning archer or someone who's just getting into it, put the time in behind your weapon so that when that all that work of planning and scouting and shed hunting, like when all that tactical stuff comes together, at the end of the day, the arrow kills the deer. It's that broadhead on the end of the arrow. And if you
Yep.
can't put it where it needs to be, none of that other shit matters. It's just the story of the one that got away. So if you're going to take anything, take what Dave just said and put the time into shooting your bow. I'm inspired. I got to go shoot my bow tomorrow because I didn't shoot in the last week.
I could go on and on. Like I literally would, and this sound, I mean, borderline obsessive with it, but like I would run sprints to elevate my heart rate. And then literally sprint 30 yards, drop to a knee, pick up my bow and shoot. Just to try to get my heart rate up to that point and like that adrenaline. It's sickening. I mean, I mean, I would shoot when my mom would go out of town. I would literally put lights on in the whole house and I'd put a target at one end of the house and I'd just shoot all night in the living room.
There's got to be some kind of quote. I don't know what it is. I'm not good at those, but something about the line between being really successful and just absolute batshit crazy. And I think flirting with it is always a really good place to be.
Yeah, there are a few holes in the walls. We don't live there anymore, but if they pulled that drywall away, they'd find some marks. I did some damage. I did not always hit the mark.
That's great, man. Well, cool. Hey, that's a great intro. And guys, I just can't say enough about that ability to get it done. I'm sure it'll come up in the stories, but Dave has always impressed me with just his killer instinct and his ability to get it done when he needs to. And without him even going on, like that is such a thing that you see in people who are consistent killers is yeah, they can get on deer, but if you aren't able to make it happen when the time counts, it's something you need to work on. And you need to work on your process being, up on your equipment because the moment of truth comes and you've got to be able to make it happen. Otherwise, uh, like we said, it's just another story. Um, but at
It's
that, we had some. Yeah, go ahead, Dave.
it's tough with social media and you look around and you see everyone they're doing this and they're doing that and they're doing this and doing that. And it helps. I'm sure what they're doing helps, but I mean, exactly what you said, Derek. That's not what kills the deer, and there's so much I think that we focus on that's not really relevant to actually, camo. That's a whole wormhole we could go down whether camo is effective or not. But guys wear blue jeans and a flannel. My uncle Scott, who was married to my aunt Karen, he wore a flannel, he ripped cigarettes, and he shot big deer. I don't know what to tell you, but he wasn't wearing any of the major name brands, but he still managed to get it done. And I know there's a lot of guys that may hear this that their relatives, they're probably in the Northwoods right now, and they go out every year. They don't have all the name brand stuff, and they get it done. So I just can't emphasize enough just that you really prioritize what's actually important. And I would say your shooting's hands down the most important thing you can focus on besides
And it's
scouting.
one.
You got to do
And
that.
it's one of those things that you have control over, right? Like
Oh yeah.
scouting, you can scout all day until you're blue in the teeth and you've worn the tread off all your boots, but the deer still has to do some things that you don't have control over to get there. But you can shoot your bow every day, even if it's 3 arrows. Like that's something that we all have control over, and that I think we should definitely do.
Yep.
So I think that's a good segue. Things we have control over, things that have helped us. That's obviously been huge for you and helpful for you, and your ability to kill deer. But I just want to turn it over to you now and say, hey, we'd love to hear a story. You kind of alluded to one with maybe your Aunt Karen or whatever you had on dial here. But as you know, on this part of the podcast, we're just kind of doing story based, like what was an aha moment, something that made you think a little bit differently about how you're going to start changing your hunting up to get at that more mature deer or upper age class deer. So I'm going to turn the floor over to you now. And if you got a story for us, we'd love to hear it.
Yeah, I got a few. We can talk about. Um, I think the one that comes to mind is actually hunting with my Aunt Karen. She bought some land in Montello. It was used to be a Christmas tree farm, and it's actually, I would say, half of it's surrounded by public ground. And opening morning, I go up there the night before. She sets up on one, so there was a small food plot. I'm trying to think of how to describe this. So
This is opening morning of archery season, right?
this is opening morning of archery season. So it's a former Christmas tree farm. So as you can imagine, there are balsams, um, some Norway spruce in there and stuff. But they're all grown up. They're about 14 18 feet tall. But she had cleared out an area for a food plot, and then there's some tree lines that go down the middle of it. She has her spot that she always goes to. She went there opening morning. I went to mine, and I remember before I went up there, you and I were looking at maps. I think you came down to my house, or I was over by you, and we were kind of looking at the property, like, you know, where to go. How do you attack this? Because it's essentially a big pine forest. There's not a lot of contour to it. Um, the trails mainly man-made, but kind of looking at it, you and I had kind of saw something on the map that we thought stood out, and I'll get to that. So opening morning comes. I think I saw a doe, and then all of a sudden I get a text. Yeah, I just saw a big buck, and I'm like, okay, which way is it heading? She's like, I think towards the food plot. And I'm like, all right, well, on this particular property, the way it's set up, if she saw this deer, if it came by me, I could eliminate a huge portion of the property, because like if it
As far as
traveled
where it's going.
yeah, as far as where it's going. But pardon me, if I didn't see the deer, I had a very good indication of where this deer was going. And it's like, okay, well, I ended up never seeing this deer. Well, thankfully she had a trail cam set up, and I'm like, cool. We go back to the house, and I think we sat till 9, and all of a sudden we start going through the card, and it's like, holy buckets, it's a big 11 pointer.
So that buck she saw walk past her trail cam,
Walk.
was that by her stand or was that somewhere between you and her? Or
It was to herself by about 70 yards, but she just saw that buck cutting through. And I knew if he went by that camera and he never came anywhere near me, he was going one spot. And I remember looking at Onyx and talking with my aunt, and I was like, okay, here's your property. It's this huge pine forest, but there's like almost like a little finger of like oaks and maples and like poplars that come out. And I was like, what's that? And they're like, oh, we never go in there. I'm like, okay. Have you ever hunted in there? Like, no, we don't. And I'm like, all right. And I remember I sat down, and I think we were watching, oh God, one of like the Mission Impossible movies. And we were just kind of talking, and I just like, it clicked. I was like, I'm gonna go. And they're like, where are you going? And it was like 11:30. And I'm like, I'm gonna get ready. And they're like, for what? And I'm like, I'm going. And like I couldn't, like, because it was just so exciting in my head. And I'm like, I gotta go, I gotta go. And they're like, what is happening? And I'm like, I know where this buck is. He's in this finger where you guys never go. And like, you guys flat out told me you never go into this area on the whole property. They have UT or ATV trails everywhere. I'm like, he's in there or he's close to there. And it was 92 degrees that day. And I'm like, I'm going in. So I think I left at noon, opening day.
So just for a little context, for anybody who's listening who's not from Wisconsin, Wisconsin's bow season comes in earlier than a lot of states. A lot of states open October 1st. Wisconsin's usually opens up like after the second week in September. So usually around like the 14th through the 18th ish. It's always the Saturday. So it's pretty early season yet. And it's usually miserably hot with a lot of bugs. So someone saying I'm going to go into the stand at 11 o'clock when it gets dark at like 8 p.m. sounds a little crazy.
I was so convinced that the deer was there that like I literally, I mean, foolishly I could have probably left at 2 and been just fine, but I I stormed out of there. I grabbed 5 bottles of water and I was wearing like the old scent lock suits that didn't breathe one bit.
Oh,
So
yeah.
I wore it was a scent lock suit and a cutoff and shorts. And I went out. I hung that stand. I think it was up by about 12:15, and I sat there and I baked and I baked. But I just the wind was perfect, and it was like a perfect finger coming out towards those pines, coming towards the food plot. And sure enough, about 4 o'clock, I look up and I just see a rack, and it was like, it's him. Oh my gosh! And he couldn't have been. I was so quiet when I went in there. He couldn't have been more than 100 yards from where I set up, and he was
Did
just
he
milling around
come when you first saw him? Was that kind of the direction you were hoping or thinking that he was coming from?
because he was working his way towards that point, heading towards that food plot. So he was just kind of browsing, just milling around, coming through, and thankfully, I mean, it was a very tight shot. I think I shot him at like 33 yards, but you know, he just slowly made his way towards me, and uh, you know, I pinwheeled him, and I think he went. I don't. I actually have the shot on film, which is really cool. And this is where when I first started getting into filming, um, with all the excitement, I didn't film the recovery. Uh, you know, I was just so excited, but I got the shot on film, and you know, my aunt, I called her and I'm like, I got him, I got him, and she's like, what? I was like, I got him, the one on camera, I found him, I got him. And like she came and we tracked and then we found him, and like I never forget like her and I just jumping for joy, like two kids that like we were just ecstatic. I mean, it was so cool. I mean, opening night, but you know, that's, you know, I've talked with you, I've listened to a lot of the Dan Infault stuff, and like literally people say like, well, if where would you go if you didn't want to be killed? And like looked at the map and literally was like, where do people never go? And you know, when you look at the map, the parking lot for the public ground is about 80 yards from where this deer started walking towards me. So I bet you that buck was bedded within 100 yards of the public land parking lot. But he can't, whether he was on the private or the public, he was within 100 yards of that public parking spot. So, I mean, that kind of, when you start thinking about that, it's like every hunter that parks, nobody sets up by the parking lot. They literally park and they walk back as far as they can or to their spot, and they blow right through this whole area. And it just so happened, I didn't know that, but like looking at it, and it was just like, started looking at it, I'm like, wow, like he was literally on top of the parking lot. So, I mean, that was the big thing for me. It was just like, okay, let's start thinking about things a little bit different.
I know that just in, since that time, and it was cool that I kind of got to be a part of that. And like you called me afterward
Yep.
uh, and explained it. And I think ever since that exact example that you just explained, I've heard you say that, like, yeah, whether it was from, like, I guess I just, you know, in my head, you had understood it from that moment on, but you never really maybe vocalized it to me. But I've heard you say it a number of times since then, like, where do people never go? Where would you want to go if you didn't want to be ever bothered by people? And like that's what made it concrete in my head that like, man, that one story like he picked out this spot that they just like, why would you hunt there? Don't hunt there. Like we don't ever go in there. And
Yeah,
boom.
that, I mean, last year we were fortunate to hunt together a couple times, and like, a couple of the spots we went by, we saw some good deer. And granted, it didn't turn out, but leading up to that, it was just like, well, this would make sense for this area that people would just blow by. So, those overlooked spots, I think even close to roads, like I think a lot of people are like, you got to go as deep as you can. I wouldn't shy away from creek bottoms near roads with thick bedding areas. I mean, that's the stuff that, those deer, they'll sit and watch, and they do. And I think that's one of those things that just people overlook, and they feel like, the trend now is you got to go deep, you got to go far, you got to isolate yourself, but you can isolate yourself just as much by going less. You know
which
what I mean?
which and I feel a little bit bad because I'm gonna make some correlations to things that folks have said that I've got to talk to in the last few weeks. And obviously you have not had the privilege yet of like hearing any of these things because like a lot of these haven't been released yet.
Yeah.
But as they come out, like that story that you just told and what you're talking about right now with these overlooked spots, the last two guys I talked to, both of their two of their takeaway things were like they were on top of this deer but didn't know it because it was just in a spot that they'd never thought to look ever. Like they were on the deer. The one guy killed the deer, and after going back and looking, the buck was bedding right behind the neighbor's barn, right on
Yeah.
the edge of their property, but laying in like a little rose thicket right behind the barn. He's like, I found that and I was like, wow, this is the only part of the property I never scouted because I just thought it was really stupid. And there it was. Like that's
Yeah.
where that buck was living.
We had a buck behind our house. It would have been 2 or 3 years ago. And he was a good one. I had him on camera, but I couldn't find him. So I threw cell cameras up like everywhere. Couldn't find him. And then Kyla went and sat, and she pulled up the binoculars. He's in the horse pasture. He was living in the pine trees right next to the horse pasture. He was there 5 nights in a row, every night with a doe in the horse pasture with the horses. Horses didn't
Where
bother
people
him,
would
and he just hung out there, and he never left that spot. But nobody ever went there. They didn't ride their horses very much, but um yeah, that was his spot. And that was something that, like, again, it just kind of reinforced, like, they're not dumb. We all know that, but it's just kind of finding those areas that people don't think to look. And the tendency is to go deep, and you got to go far away, but a lot of times they don't know the difference.
and I think that's one of the coolest things that like comes out of like a little story based thing like what we're doing here. Like you talk tactics and all the tactics are, they're phenomenal. Like, top
Oh yeah.
third bedding with the wind, the thermals. And I think you can go do that. You can go look at those spots anywhere in the country and there will be bucks there. I promise. And the last guest said it great. Logan said, like I feel like those tactics are awesome for 3-year-olds and sometimes 4-year-olds, but it's the big mature deer that find those little slips, those little spots
Yeah.
that you just wouldn't know or you can't hunt or and I, and I, and I think that's 100% accurate. There's nothing wrong with a 3-year-old deer. Like I'm tickled to shoot one, but like when you start really going after that upper echelon of animal, they find those spots that are either almost impossible to hunt or you don't even think to hunt them. And that's why they're in those spots because you can't teach. That's not a tactic you can teach. Overlooked spots. Oh yeah, I'll just look for overlooked spots. But your brain is programmed to not freaking recognize them.
Yeah.
like like wherever you think you're gonna find one, you're not. It's gotta be somewhere like just freaking weird.
Well, and that was even like yesterday. I went out and did some scouting and hung some cameras in that spot I was telling you about. It was a former farm field. It's no longer being farmed, but it's just grown up. But like when you stand there and like I noticed this, it would have been the second weekend of the season. I was sitting there and all of a sudden these bucks just started appearing like out of this field. And I'm like, what the hell's going on? Like, I can see the whole field. I can literally glass everything. If something walked out of a tree line, I see it. Like, there's no way these deer weren't bedded in that field. And then you get down there and you start looking, because everything from the tree stand 20 feet up looks the same. But then you get
Is
down
this
and like,
that
yes,
wild? Is this like that wildflowery,
yeah,
grassy field you sent me a picture of?
yeah. So yesterday I was out there and like you literally watch the field and it goes like this and it starts going like this. And where it looks like it's tall grass, those are actually saplings. And the saplings now are at about 8 feet tall. So I literally just bombed through it just to see if I could find deer bedding. And sure enough, I got into the heart of it and it was like a jungle, but there's beds in there. And I would say 90% of the people would walk by and they're just like, yeah, it's a big overgrown field. That's where every buck's living.
Is
That's
that
where,
the one? Didn't you pick up some shed antlers around there or in there or close to
y-
there or something?
yep. And that's, again, I mean, I passed 2 bucks the second weekend. I regret passing one of them, but, um, they were in there. And I walked out there in the fall and then not in the fall, in the winter, and every sapling just torn to pieces. So again, and this is a property with a lot of hunting pressure. A lot. I mean, there's group to the north, there's a group to the south, there's a number of people within this property, but literally when I talked to the land manager, it was kind of like, well, where's everybody hunting? And he's like, well, they're kind of all in this area. And it's just like, perfect. They're not in that field. And all of a sudden I go to the field and that's where the deer are. Granted, one year to the next crop, but part of me thinks there was beans to the west on that property. So early, a lot of those deer, I have them on film going to the west. So I think that was a huge draw for them, was close bedding to the beans early, especially in that second, third week in September. But with the crop shift now, I'm not sure if they're going to be there, but there was beds in there, so we'll see. But that's a spot that opening weekend just to get up in glass, and then the second sit move in to kill, that might be in on the docket for me just to kind of observe and scope everything out.
I think what you just said is a subtle tip in itself that maybe just sounds like a somewhat vague game plan, but year to year, like you said, when you're on a property that has a lot of egg around it and the egg shifts, like you were talking about bean fields and it was to the west this year, probably not, it's going to be different. Whatever sign you saw last year, or whatever, movement you observed, it's probably going to be slightly different this year. So getting up, like you said, and just observing, like, oh, they're still using the similar area, but now instead of exiting this way, they're exiting totally the opposite way to go over
Yeah,
here. So getting that observation in before you go in and just make a wild guess, which is something I'd probably do, is probably going to be a huge benefit to you. Like that's just something that, like, as a younger hunter, you might just throw all your chips on the table, but as somebody who's done it before, getting that observation set, especially if you have that luxury, that's one thing we've talked about with a number of people, is like, in Wisconsin, if you're not in egg country, visibility is really limited. Like if you're
yeah,
hunting woods and lowland, like most of even our lowland stuff, it looks like grass, but it's all way over a deer's head. It's like our visibility is limited. If you have the option to observe deer, if that's like feasible, freaking do that. Like you're
yeah,
gonna learn a lot more from watching them than you are from sitting in a spot hoping they walk through your 30-yard bubble without ever, and then you
yeah.
don't see anything. You don't learn a damn thing.
I agree.
Hot diggity. Yeah, I'm excited for you for early season there. You
Yeah,
did end up you did end up killing a really good buck. I don't know if
yeah,
it was from that same spot or somewhere similar, but it was something that was kind of like grassy, right?
yeah. It was close to there.
Was it? And that
Yeah,
was later in the season.
Yeah, October 16th, I think it was. And I wasn't even planning on hunting that day. And then all of a sudden, this huge rainstorm came in, and it was gonna like die at like, you know, 2 hours before dark. And it was just like, Kyla, I gotta go hunting. She's like, well, you're going tomorrow. I'm like, no, I'm not going tomorrow. I'm going tonight. And she's like, okay. And I'm like, nope, I don't need to go tomorrow. I need to go tonight. The rain's coming in. It's gonna stop. Calm down. It's gonna be perfect. Like I literally like the wind. I grabbed my stuff and I ran out the door and you know, you get out there and it's pouring on me as I'm getting out there, but as soon as I get in the stand, it just stops. And it's dead calm. And I actually brought rattling antlers with me that night. And it was a little early, I thought, but I had seen somebody on Instagram or Facebook had posted some trail cam pictures of bucks fighting. And it wasn't terribly far from where I'm located in southeastern Wisconsin. So I'm like, well, I mean, if they're fighting, why not? And this person has video and I can see the timestamp. I'm like, I'm going to do it. So I literally grab the horns and I just start wailing on them as hard as I can. It like sounds like a brawl. And do that, hang the horns up, and no more than 30 seconds later, I look and here he comes across the field and he is pissed. And like, he's coming in hot. And I'm like, holy cow. And like, I'm trying to watch him and I'm filming and I'm trying to get him in film. And I got a new lens. So I'm trying to get him in focus and I screwed that up. So I'm going back and forth and I'm getting him and I got him right within 30 yards and stopped him. I drill him. He runs off and I think he went about 80 yards. And I think he was a 10 pointer. But, it was just one of those things that like it just happened so quick. But, October 16th, using rattling antlers. And like I told a couple of people that and they're like, you rattled them in? And it's like, yeah. And they're like, why in the world did you do that? I'm like, well, the guy on Instagram posted a video of two bucks fighting at night. And it's like, well, if they're fighting at night, they would still fight in the day, you know? So I think that's one way that social media has helped is like, I use that truthfully as like activity because I can't be in the woods a ton and I don't have a ton of cameras. But I do see what other people post and I know where other people are kind of located. So like when they post actively their cameras and I can see the deer's behavior, I'll look at that and kind of be like, okay, well, the bucks are starting to fire up a little bit, and whether they're trickling horns together or all brawling, um, but just pulling that little piece, that helped me tremendously. And literally, the only reason I brought the rattling antlers is because a guy on Instagram from southeastern Wisconsin posted two bucks fighting the night before, and they were actually getting into it pretty good. And I'm like, you know what, this is worth a shot.
But I think the other big piece of that story too, like that was you got to use the most recent information, whether it's your information or not. If you know
Yeah,
the person's in your general area, that's a very clever thing to do. The other piece of that information was realizing the opportunity the weather played for you, and the weather was a big aspect on a podcast I recently recorded with Steve Shirk, and he runs like 130 trail cameras and he's very meticulous at compiling weather. And he said that weather has become one of the biggest things. So I think, yeah, deer get revved up at times. And, before that pre rut, October 16th in Wisconsin is a little bit before what we would generally think of
yeah,
like the pre
absolutely.
rut. But boy, if it's been raining all day, especially big, heavy rain, those deer have kind of been, you know, held down a little bit or kind of like muffled, and then all of a sudden that rain breaks right before it starts to get dark and you hit those. I mean, I think pairing those two things together, taking recent information even if it wasn't yours, but then playing the weather and saying instead of hunting tomorrow, telling the wife, hey, we got to switch it up, I got to get out there tonight because this weather front is perfect. Pairing those two things together was just a great move and obviously a deadly move, like put a big buck in front of you.
Yeah, you know, I think after a couple years of really diving in deep of it and just really, I don't know how to say this properly, but trusting your gut. And I know, you hear the top third on the hills. You hear you should do this, you hear you should do that, but sometimes your gut tells you to do something. And like there's been a lot of times where I haven't gone 2 spots because it's just like, and you and I talk about this all the time. It's like, that sounds really dumb. Like, why would you ever go do that? And then it's like, well, hold on, that might work. Like, so kind of thinking outside of the box of what like everyone tells you you should sit in this type of spot, this type of terrain, but just trusting your gut, I found has helped me, I would say 90% of the time. Is just like, if my gut says to go do something, and you saw this last year with me, like hunting, it was just like, I'm going here. And you're like, why in the world? I'm like, I don't know. My gut's telling me I need to go to this spot. I got a feeling, and just kind of trusting that gut instinct. And I think a lot of times we fight that because we see other people do a lot of different things, and that's what we need to do. And even if like my gut's wrong, I can still check off that box, because if I didn't trust my gut and I went and did something else, I would always kind of second guess myself, like, damn it, I wonder what would have happened if I would have went with that. So there's, just, the weather, like, that I'm supposed to hunt one day, I'm going to hunt this day because my gut's telling me as soon as this weather breaks, they're going to be moving. I need to go now. The buck I shot an opening day, like I literally went in at like noon, and it was just like, I need to get in there really early and set this up, and like just kind of trusting that gut instinct. I think a lot of people fight that, and I think for people getting into it, just run with it. And if it doesn't work, that's okay, because 99% of the time nothing works. It's just the 1% of the time that it actually does.
And that the other part that goes with that is, you know, a lot of times when you try something weird or different, when it doesn't pan out, that's still an absolute learning opportunity if you let your mind see it as that. Like, well,
Yeah.
hey, I tried this and in this opportunity and it didn't work. Like, you can learn just as much from failed hunts, if not more, than successful ones.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that I know I get caught up in my own mind because, man, I love thinking about this shit. We discuss this stuff like we're just eaten up by this. So like, I think one of my big detriments is getting caught up more in my mind than trusting my gut. Where like, I found this spot and I really want it to work, but no matter how much you want something to do what you want it to do, you know what I mean? Like, it
Yep.
can't do that. And I'm a classic guy of like, when I find it in my head, this is what's going on. And like, even if my gut's saying like that's probably not happening, I'm like, I'm gonna try it anyway.
Well,
When really I
that,
should just listen to my gut and like follow the realistic deer sign.
well, that was even like the cell camera I hung yesterday. I told you, like in my mind, I've been planning this for 4 months now. This is gonna work. And then after I hung it and I got back to my truck, I'm like, I'm not gonna see a deer. This is great. I'm not gonna see a single deer. Thankfully, I got a doe, so I was wrong. But it's just you're right and wrong, and you just trial and error it. Like, you just kind of go for it. And that hunt, that I shot the one on opening day, it was 92 degrees. I think it was 94 when I shot it. So like early season, hot weather, it's like I'm diving in. But we had a hunt last year, month later, I think it was warmer. And kind of in my mind, I'm like, well, you know what? I've killed them on 94-degree days, but that was in September. When we were hunting, that was October, and I never really thought about that. And that reflection piece, it was just like, well, when you killed that one, it was much earlier than when we were hunting now. And I think that night we hunted together when it was 90 plus degrees, I didn't see a single deer. And just that's another piece that, like, reflecting on that stuff, and just not like, it's not a failure. You just got to look at it like, okay, maybe why didn't I see the deer? And it's just like, well, um, you saw a lot of deer the second week of September when it was 90. Well, now you're in the first week of October. Their coats make a major shift between those 3 to 4 weeks, and that could play a huge part. So like now my thinking is like, well, if it's 90 in October, I'm probably not going to be so gung ho to get out there. But first week, second week of September, I don't care because they've been doing it all summer. But
Yeah.
I would just that ability to reflect and look at that stuff. And I journal a lot of my hunts and just write the stuff down of like the weather, what it was like when I saw the deer, what they were doing, and kind of looking back at that and just trying to diagnose why. I found has been very beneficial.
I think, and that's something that I've mentioned multiple times, and that anyone who listens to any episode of this Dropping Pin series is going to realize is that, like, in order to get better, you really have to want to get better. Like, you have to have that growth mindset and, like, be able to reflect on almost everything, like what the deer did, what you did, why you did it, why you thought the deer did it, why they didn't do what you thought they were like. You've got to question a lot, and that's something that I think as educators, like going through college, Dave and I went to college together. Like I felt like I had to write reflections on the reflections on what I reflected on. Like
Yeah.
it was just a part of the profession that we had to do all the time. Like how well did that work? How would you change stuff? So that's something that I took from my career training. And absolutely in the deer woods, like I'm constantly just doing that because it's helpful. And I think every person that I've talked on here so far, and I'm lucky because I get to handpick everybody I talk to. So it's all people I want to learn stuff from. And everyone that I have talked to has been exactly that mindset, and that's no surprise. Like you can't get anywhere doing the same thing you've always done. You've got to try new stuff and you've got to push outside your comfort zone and do the things that maybe you weren't comfortable or didn't think of doing the previous season.
Yeah, and that's the beauty of bow hunting, and that's where I've always gravitated towards bow hunting. Um, Again, a rifle, you can shoot a couple hundred yards. You know, to see a decent buck at a couple hundred yards isn't that difficult. Especially depending on where you're sitting. I mean, time of year, you're bound to see one. But the bow, you got to be close. Getting within that 20-yard mark. The real skilled guys try to get 10-yard shots. I mean, that's the art of archery is not trying to shoot them at 75. It's how close can you get to the deer and actually kill it. So you know that's the cool stuff. When you really start diving in and reflecting on your different spots and why you did what you did and what worked and what you could do better next time, and just that constant. It's chess. It's not checkers.
All right, I just decided I kind of want to throw you for a loop here. I'm going to ask you a question you're unprepared for. You had some good stories here, but uh, yeah, I'm gonna see what you do. I'm gonna put you on your toes. Sorry about that, Dave. But so we've gone down. Dave's hunted in Illinois on some public ground. We went for a late season hunt years ago. You were nice enough. I already had a tag from a failed fall hunt, and you bought a tag and then drove down with me. That was quite a wild rodeo. But
Yeah.
then you came down and you've done some scouting in the summer months. Last year, you had a successful hunt. Sorry about that. And I'm just, that's a little bit different terrain than a lot of, you've hunted southwestern Wisconsin, which is major hill country. But
Yep.
I feel like that was years ago. Like this is a new terrain, totally new area. Um, what I'm going to ask you for some sort of little story or takeaway. Like, what have you noticed so far? You haven't been down there a ton, but what little learning moments have you had, or little ahas, or a story you could share about going to somewhere that maybe was a little bit different than what you're used to? I know you kind of did a similar thing in Missouri. Dave started hunting in Missouri with a couple buddies, and you found awesome success there doing kind of your game plan of where don't people go. But I just want to put you on the spot here. And what have you picked up maybe in the last couple of years in going down to this public land that you think could potentially help a young or novice or a little bit greenhorn hunter?
Oh man, oh man, oh man. They're putting me on the spot here. I would say after doing the walking and doing the scouting and being down there and kind of seeing the makeup of the land, um, everyone wants to dive into the timber and they want to be out in the big woods and the big hills. Um, if you want to see deer, in my opinion, find grass, find CRP fields, find those isolated fingers that on hilltops that go out and they look like they're just barren tall grass. I promise you, you have deer in there. That was especially going down there and walking and scaling hills, going up and down, and of course on the hillsides you have good sign, but being in the CRP, being in the grass, if I could give anyone a tip, I would say do what you want to do, but make sure you walk through those CRP fields and just be prepared. Because every sapling within the CRP field is going to be shredded. Granted, they could be night, but even check out the tree clumps in the middle of those CRP fields. It could be like three or four. I don't think they don't have buckthorn down there, but they're similar to like a buckthorn tree. But if you go to those, there's beds in every little bed and pot, every little tree you come to in the middle of these fields, those deer are using. So when you try to dive into the big timber and you get up on this beautiful ridge and you're looking like, man, the deer got to be around here. But then 200 yards away, there's a CRP field with like 8 or 9 clumps of trees. That's where your deer are. I would almost bet my life on it. So if I were giving anyone a tip with diving into that land, is don't overlook the grass. I think big bucks love grass. And I think that's one of the things I learned from you with kind of going on these adventures and like scouting these spots. And like at first I was kind of not in disbelief, but um I don't know if I necessarily had the buy-in. But then after like walking it and seeing it, it's like, oh my lord, like there's a ton of deer traffic out here. And I just remember jumping deer constantly out of these CRP fields. Um, and then being in the timber because the timber is so wide open and it looks like you're watching a Drury video. I mean, they're like perfect. Like, oh my gosh, there's a creek with running water and there's a nice bottom and there's little grass in there. And it's like, wow, this is like picture perfect. And there's not a deer to be seen. But you start getting up into those grassy areas and it's just like overrun. And I do think those deer use those other spots, but um, that the CRP, those edges on those hilltops or even CRP bottoms leading up to ridges, that is kind of mind blowing to me. Like I was pretty taken back by that.
Yeah, that's definitely a really good point. Um, and time of year makes a difference a lot with those
Yeah.
two. I mean, we've walked in the summer and cut across CRP fields, and it can be absolutely miserable. Some of those ones that have blackberry bushes,
Yep.
those huge. I mean, they'll grow 10 feet tall and have thorns the size of your pinky finger. But I mean, in all reality, deer eat blackberry leaves,
Yeah.
and that provides tons of shade. Even if you don't see trees out there in the early season, those spots can be absolute dynamite because they can just tuck in the grass next to some blackberry, and they've got a little cave of shade that'll
Yep.
work for however many hours of the day. And there's just browse out there. I mean, there's so many different types of plants. So I think, yeah, that's definitely a good point. I just had to ask, because I've never really asked you before. So I wanted to just get your opinion on that.
Yeah. The other thing too is just, you know, mm, I'll know more this year, I think. But just don't be afraid to be close to the parking lot. After doing some scouting, um, a lot of the best sign that I found was within 300 yards of the parking lot. And all the trail cameras I found were a half a mile deep. So I can assure you, and all the flashlights I saw were going deep. Um, don't be afraid to be close to the parking lots.
And yeah, without giving away all the trade secrets of everything, in case any of you are coming down and hunting where we're hunting, um, along with that line of like, don't be afraid to be close to the parking lot. I'm just going to pull out a little story from the spring when we were down there. Myself, you, and our good buddy Adam were down doing some scouting and some shed hunting. And one of the spots we'd gone to, we had seen a whole bunch of deer. And there's shed hunting pressure everywhere nowadays. So like you're almost competing to go walk the woods in the spring and look for sheds.
Yeah.
And we
Yeah.
had kind of kept that in the back of our mind because we saw people and there was boot tracks all over. And not that we were just there to find antlers. We're there to scout and figure out where we're going to hunt, but finding antlers is always great. So I think that one spot where we had some green fields where there were some deer, we kind of parked and I just said, you know what? Like, it wasn't even that I wanted to be close to the parking lot, but I said, instead of going through the field where the parking lot pulls in, I'm just going to walk down the road, 100 yards or 200 yards and cut in a different spot. And that goes along with the same adage of like, don't do what other people are doing. Like, if you think other people are doing something, do something else. I walked in a slightly different spot and kind of wrapped around and it brought me to this little ridge. I ended up finding a couple of sheds there. But it was just one of those things where like the shed hunting pressure had all like everybody seemed to have gone to the same spot, the same area, but you do something just a little bit different. And that's
Yeah.
always like you rattled on October 16th. How many other guys were rattling in Wisconsin that day? Not that many, because everybody thinks you got to wait till November 1 to rattle, or
Yeah.
everybody's got their date. Doing something a little bit different than what all the other people are doing is always going to be a good thing, whether it's a failed one that you learn from, or it could be the ticket to the biggest deer you've ever killed. I guess
Yeah.
you just never know. Dang, yeah. Well, Dave, you got any? Is there anything else you wanted to talk about? Share? You got any other stories you wanted to drop on us, or what are you thinking?
Oh goodness.
Were you going to mention your gun season buck this last year, or is that for another day?
No, I can briefly talk about that, and that was just kind of strategic camera
I like
setup.
how you set that whole thing up. Yeah, you know
Uh,
what? Don't even
yeah.
brief. Just give
I
us
think
the rundown because that's a
I
good
think
one.
about it every day. I wonder if he thinks about me as much as I think about him. I miss him dearly, and I hope I see him again because it's going to be different. But the one property I can hunt, I've been able to hunt it now for almost 5 years, so I have it pretty well figured out when they're moving, how they're going to move, and come pre-rut when the deer start actively chasing, this becomes a hot spot. Like literally, I don't need to go there probably until October 25th. October 25th is kind of like my golden date. Like if I could almost hunt any day of the year, I would probably pick October 25th just because I really feel like that's when it starts to really turn and like they're not locked up. They're it's kind of that we're getting warm. So
So
I
just to clarify for listeners, real quick. So does that mean like, are you pretty much staying out of there until that date, or are you like throwing a hunt here and there, or are you hunting it fairly consistently? Like, what are you physically
I will
doing on that?
hunt it probably twice. And yeah, probably two times. One really, really early, depending on what's in the fields. The farmer, the ground was too moist. He couldn't get his tractor back there, so it's actually barren. I might actually go back there and try to put in a food plot coming in the next couple weeks just to see if I can do something. But even with the lack of food, it's still a natural funnel for the deer. So literally, um, I set up cameras strategically, and people might give me flack for this, but I do. I literally do. I'll set up cameras strategically, and when the deer start moving like they are, um, I move in. And I stayed out of this area. There was one really, really good buck. I stayed out of there, didn't touch it. I hunted it maybe twice, three times, and I was just holding. And I think I texted you and I said, he's there, and he was with a
I think
doe.
you sent me a picture from your cell cam, and I think it was like you just said. I think it was a doe, and you could just make out his frame in the
Yeah,
back.
and that was, one that, he came through, and I knew there was a hot doe in the area, and there's only so many spots typically, um, where they're gonna hold their doe. And I went in, and it was picture perfect. I mean, I screwed this up so bad it couldn't even be funny. Um, Biggest buck of my life, and I watched him chase this doe one end of the hayfield and back all over. She cuts east, and he hooks down along the edge of the cornfield to catch her downwind. The only spot I could actually get a shot at him, and he was face on. Um, my shotgun at 90 yards, freehand, and I missed. Well, I hit him, but I grazed him. If I would, I mean, I literally took it to the computer and like did calculations. Like if I would have been 2 inches to the right, he would have piled. Um, but that was one where I had the camera strategically placed. I had a mock scrape set up, so deer were coming in, checking that scrape. Does were coming in, checking that scrape, and then all of a sudden, like he was there, and that's
Is
when I
that
moved
picture
it.
you when you initially got that one piece of information that like springs you into action? I think that was at like night or early in the morning, right? Or like I mean, it was dark out, wasn't it?
Yeah, he came through. It would have been at like 2 in the morning, and when I woke up, I saw the picture, and then I went out hunting.
Because you knew
That
she's
doe,
in there, he's in there.
yeah, and then the it's hard to describe the property because there's only so many areas for these deer. I mean, it's very rural and it's very country and it's ag, but there's not much cover. So like there's only so many pockets. Um and with him having that doe, he had that doe. He was not letting her go. So I figured he was probably in that area. I mean, he could have pushed her half a mile across the cornfield, but like I would say on she was there, and sure enough, and then after going through that whole heartbreaking ordeal of wounding him, I repositioned all the cameras, and I spent the better part of a month trying to re-find him. And then I did. And then I remember I was sitting on the couch. It was like 6 o'clock at night. And of course it's dark by then. Um, and I don't have a muzzle loader. And it was during the muzzle loader season. And all of a sudden he showed back up. And I can see the wound in his leg. And like I went out the next day, hung a stand about 8 feet off the ground in a dead tree, just almost in a pocket, and I sat dark to dark, hoping that he would walk down. I only had shot to one trail, but it was the trail that I got the picture on, and I sat there dark to dark, and I didn't see a single deer. But you know, and then 2 days later, he showed back up on that same trail. But that's one thing that using trail cameras to your advantage and really understanding the ground, I think is extremely beneficial. And knowing when to go in and when not to go. Because I mean, the convenience of this spot, it, I mean, I could hunt it every night, and with the right wind, probably not booger it, but literally, like, we will not hunt this spot until probably end of October, just because it's not worth it. I mean, you might catch a buck coming through early, but I would say your best bet with the natural contour of the land and what they follow. There's a creek nearby, and they kind of follow that, and it funnels them. Your best bet is just to understand the ground, and just as much as I want to go do it, I won't. And I'll just almost throw observation sits, whether it's just driving around or hanging a stand up in a tree and just like getting as high as humanly possible and just glassing to see where I can see deer move through, but not blowing up a spot just because I want to hunt.
Yeah, I think that just goes. I mean, I've watched you. I mean, we've we've obviously been friends for a long time. So once you got permission on this property, watching you year by year kind of break down, oh, this is what's happening at this time of year, and realizing what you had as a travel corridor between two different areas that house deer, the deer live, realizing what you had, and then just how you had your cell camera set up to enter. And you tell me, dude, as soon as I get a good buck that's moving, like not just meandering through, but like moving through to check, it's on.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's knowing your area and like how the deer move through your area. And then the second piece of like your story with that gun buck, the thing that I'm kind of thinking of and taking is you specifically said he could have pushed her across, this big cornfield, cut cornfield or whatever, to another location. But what do bucks want to do when does are in heat? Do they want to push them over all sorts of different land where to spread her scent to attract more deer? Or they want to pin her down in the
Oh yeah.
first little weird spot so that scent is not spreading? Like, you didn't say that, but you knew that. Like, I know you know that. And like, that's why you were gun ho. Like, you saw the picture, boom, I'm in there. Because like, they want to be somewhere, you know, that's just going to leave them alone. And
Yeah. It's not like
knowing
it's
your land,
where they're going miles. Like they're they get them in those, like an isolated oak tree in the middle of a field. Like he'll pin her next to that. You know what I mean? He'll like not let her move. Um, but with that terrain, with the cameras, with technology being the way it is, I'll literally go back through every camera since I think I went back all the way back to um 2019 when I started hunting this particular area, and I would literally chart when the first daylight buck showed up every year. And it's always between that October 15th and October 25th. As soon as that date hits, boom, it's on. Anything before then, you'll get them all at night. And that's just for my one particular area, but using that data and like just being in education, like be very data driven, I'll go back through and just like, okay, when's my first daylight picture of a buck? And like just start charting. Okay, so this scrappy 8-pointer showed up in daylight. When's the first mature buck showing up in daylight? And just really start like charting it and to figure out like when, like, because my sits are limited. I don't have the freedom to hunt every night. So it's like if I'm putting all my eggs into a basket, when am I going? And using that data I found is invaluable. Like it's huge, and thankfully cell cameras do help in that regard.
oh, for sure. I do have bad news for you though. Our Illinois trip this year, I think, is falling right around October 25th. So you might have to figure out how to shoot your Wisconsin deer a little earlier.
Well, I hope they have that done opening weekend.
Yeah, you'll be back to your opening weekend spot, and I'm sure you'll get her done.
Yeah.
Well, hey Dave, it was great talking to you, and I appreciate you carving some time out of your busy summer to sit down and talk some deer with me on the podcast. So I really appreciate it. Thanks for
Yeah,
sharing your stories and your knowledge.
I really appreciate you having me on. Thank you.
Yeah, man, it was good. Hopefully, our listeners were able to pull a couple good things out of there. I enjoyed that a lot, and reliving some stories that obviously I've maybe heard a time or two before, but making some educational pullaways from that are always a good thing. So we'll keep you posted on how Dave's season's going. I'm sure we'll get you back on here at some point, and maybe we'll
Next,
dissect
tell
that
'em,
the
uh,
booner you shoot in Illinois.
next time we tell them about the dorm.
Oh gosh, yeah, that's a good story. That's a good. You want to learn something from the story? You'll learn something from that story. All right,
Hey,
buddy. You have a good night.
yeah, you too, Derek.
All right. See you.